Hello everybody! Welcome to Masonzero MTG. My name is Mason in a rare facecam video. And today we're talking about Cube, of course, one of my favorite things to talk about on this channel. And specifically we're going to be talking about cube building philosophy. And I've assembled 5, I suppose, tips, tricks, lessons, whatever you want to call it. I've assembled 5 of them. And they're not necessarily the 5 most important. They might not even be my top 5. They're just the 5 that I thought of and wanted to talk about in this video. And they're all kind of interconnected because the final culminating lesson that sums them all up is that anything you do in your cube is going to affect every other part of it, and nothing exists in a vacuum. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Lesson number 1, make sure that cards can cover multiple archetypes. Essentially what this boils down to is that more decks than one should want to play any given card. Now this can't apply to 100% of your cards. Sometimes cards are purely an aggro card or purely a control card or something, but a good chunk of cards in your cube should be playable in a variety of decks so that more people want to draft them. In a cube with strong draft themes like that, you will very quickly run into cards that you want to play because they're cool and good for a theme, but that are only picked up for drafters who are drafting that theme. One example is a card like a Johnny's Pridemate. Pretty cool card if you're running a life gain deck. If you are drafting life gain, that's a card that you might want to pick up. However, you're not going to want to pick it up unless you're in life gain. You need a certain density of life gain cards in order for a Johnny's Pridemate to be worth the 2 mana and the card that it costs to play. Having signpost cards like this that draw drafters into a theme like life gain are really important. It's good to have them because it tells people what kind of decks you can draft, especially if they haven't looked at your list. And it can sometimes convince them to go into that because a card that has a Johnny's Pridemate style thing might be something powerful. That card's not like super crazy, but it is a clear signpost. But when you have too many of those, it can make drafts kind of be on rails. Like, oh, I'm going to draft a life gain deck. I can wheel this a Johnny's Pridemate because no one else is drafting life gain because I took all the life gain cards. Everyone's just kind of going to do their own thing, and there's not going to be any sort of politics or any sort of nuance to the draft. And this is no fun for you as the cube designer because you are going to end up with the same decks every time. The cube draft is going to end up being just the same games time after time, and that's not fun. You want variety. You want to see new things that you didn't think of that your cube could do. Now, not every card needs to cover every archetype. I think that you are allowed to have cards that only fit in certain decks, obviously. That works in a normal Magic draft. There are cards that are only good in certain decks. However, I think there are a lot of opportunities to find cards that fit into multiple archetypes. And one of the ones that comes to mind for me, especially in the context of my sort of peasant cube that is focused on synergy, is a card like Pteramander. First of all, it flies, so it can fit into a flying theme or anything that requires evasion. It has an ability that cares about having instants and sorceries in the graveyard, so it's a nice creature for a spells deck or a control deck. And its ability puts +1/+1 counters on it, so if you have any +1/+1 counters themes in your cube, that works really well with that. So basically, it goes in blue-white flying, blue-black control, blue-red spells, or blue-green counters. It can go in any color of deck, which I think is great. And obviously, not going to work in every cube, but in something like a peasant-themed cube or like the arena cube that goes really deep into archetypes, that's the kind of card you want to draw across many different themes. Lesson number 2, beware of parasitic cards and mechanics, but realize that density can fix this. In a cube based on specific synergies and themes, it can be tempting to go all in on cards that are really good payoffs, but you can go a little too hard on this. One of my favorite examples is a card like Hardened Scales. This card is literally only good in a counters deck, and it requires a certain density of counters to be good. Otherwise, it is just an enchantment that does literally nothing. But in the right deck, it can be very strong. This is true for any mechanic or theme, regardless of how specific or generic it is. You need the support in order to make it strong, otherwise it's weak. But keep this in mind, as you change things in your cube, it will change other things that you didn't intend. So for example, as you increase the number of cards that care about +1/+1 counters, making Hardened Scales a better card, so too do you increase the power of cards that can remove counters from permanents. Because a lot of people have pet cards or cards that they think they need to include, and this might be an argument to think about that a little more. And I think these more general cubes run cards, again, that don't require a specific theme in order to be good, and fit into a lot of decks. At the very least, control, aggro, mid-range, combo, that kind of thing. Mother of Runes, Treasure Cruise, Grave Titan, Bone Crusher Giant, Tireless Tracker, all of these cards are good on their own, in a vacuum, no context. But some of them, like Tireless Tracker, more powerful in a deck that cares about lands or artifacts. And if you have cards that care about lands or artifacts, this already powerful card, Tireless Tracker, is going to get more powerful and more desirable. So you see how you can modulate the power level of cards by the context of the other cards in your cube. That sounds obvious, but it's something that I think a lot of people forget about, myself included, and cards can become way more powerful than they have any right to be. I think I've mentioned this in a video before, but I had to ban Cruel Ultimatum from my cube. Yeah, Cruel Ultimatum. Because of some other cards in my cube, I cannot have the ultimatums in my cube because they are too strong. And I found that out the hard way one time, so it really just depends on what else is in your cube. But to end off this tip about parasitic mechanics in cards, again, it's obvious, density can overcome any sort of weakness. If you want infect and poison counters in your cube, just make sure you have enough that it's draftable, but also make sure that you have enough counter to it, cards that remove counters in this case. But don't just throw a single infect card that is not capable of winning the game on its own in your cube, unless you really just like something else about it. But don't trick players into thinking that they're gonna build a poison deck when in fact there is one card that has infect and they have to sort of build around making that work, and it just doesn't. Make sure that single focus cards are well supported. Going back to my thing about cards that only fit into one category, well, a card like a Johnny's Pridemate obviously fits into a very specific category, but this can become a problem even with cards that fit into only aggro, only control, only mid-range, only combo. It can happen even to these cards. Sometimes you throw in some aggro cards because you feel like you have to, but you don't provide enough support for these aggro cards, and you don't provide enough density for these aggro cards. So aggro as an entire archetype, you just can't really do in your cube, and it's not viable. And sometimes this is an intentional choice, but you don't want to trick drafters into thinking aggro, or whatever mechanic or theme, is viable by putting in these cards that are traditionally for it. A single aggro card does not mean that you support aggro, and I actually ran into this one time with one of my friend's cubes. Very crazy powered cube. He had a real Black Lotus, all the mocks. It was crazy. It's the one and only time I've ever held a Black Lotus in my hand. And of course, everyone was doing these crazy 4 and 5 color good stuff decks with Moxes and Black Lotus and returning things from the graveyard and all this crazy stuff. And I was still on the new end of being a Magic player, so I wasn't confident enough to be able to use those cards correctly. So I didn't draft most of them, and I figured, hey, I'll draft aggro. I saw a pretty early Figure of Destiny, and I thought, great, looks like aggro support. That's a great blue-red card. Like, maybe it's okay in mid-range because it can grow, but ultimately, that's a signpost for me that, Boros aggro is probably a thing. And I picked up some other cards that were good support cards for aggro, like Hellrider. But the problem was, nothing else really came together. I couldn't find a critical mass of small, aggressive creatures or token makers or anything like that. There was some, but no one else at the table was drafting aggro. They were all drafting these degenerate combo decks, and yet even me, the lone Boros aggro player, couldn't assemble an aggro deck. I think I lost every game. I didn't stand a chance against these decks. So not only was I not able to assemble an aggro deck in the draft, I wasn't able to even have it be competitive against other things in the cube, which really begs the question of why would you even put those aggro cards in there? And honestly, I think that it was because he felt like he had to. At the time, Figure of Destiny and Hellrider and some of these other aggro signpost cards were just cube staples. So he put them in to be like, hey, I support aggro. Not considering the fact that aggro wasn't even viable, even if you could draft it. If you're going to include cards, make sure that you have intention behind it. Make sure that it is a draftable deck and that it's balanced, that the power level of your cards in one archetype or type of deck match the power level of cards in the rest. Lesson number 4, include enough interaction without diluting the pool. This is another thing that's hard for thematic and archetype-based cubes, is including removal and interaction in general. because every counter spell, every kill spell that you put in is less density of synergy for your themes, except, maybe control or spell slingers or whatever. Every path to exile you put in is one less ephemerate for your blink deck, essentially. And the level of interaction you include is a conscious choice for how your games are going to go. More interaction means that games will be more interesting, obviously more interactive. They'll go longer, potentially. More cards will see play as the game goes longer. But less interaction means that your thematic decks will be able to do their thing more often, as they'll be interrupted less. But games might also go quicker, you might see less cards, and the games might feel more like a game of solitaire, as each player does their own thing, tries to assemble whatever they're doing, and then one player will win. So of course there's no right answer to this question of how much interaction is the right amount, because it depends on what you want out of your cube, and that's a personal decision. But I would say that if raw power level is not really a concern and you're more into the thematic, I would say try to weaken your interaction by making it more thematic. For example, Thrashing Brontodon is great if you have dinosaurs. It's good removal, but if it supports Dinosaur Tribal, then that's great. You want that card over other ones you might rather play. Spread the Sickness is pretty expensive for creature removal, but if you have a lot of counters or planeswalkers or poison or any other thing in your cube, then it'll be well worth the extra cost because of its combo with other things in the cube. Creature-based interaction like Ravenous Chupacabra is great because a spell is a one-time thing, but a creature will stick to the board, and that can be more dynamic and work towards you finishing the game in a creature-based deck. So I think you can find ways to add more interaction without ruining the draft themes that you're trying to achieve. But it can be hard to reach this equilibrium and find something that works really well for you. And lesson number 5, keep in mind how the power level of a card changes with its environment. I think a lot of novice cube designers, myself included when I was a newer Magic player, we see a card that is powerful in Commander or Standard or Vintage or whatever, and we toss it in our cube because it's a powerful card and it's a cool card and we want our cube to be a representation of the best cards in Magic. However, while a lot of cards that are played in those formats and are powerful on their own, a good chunk of them are only powerful in context. Let's look at one from a few years ago, Narset Parter of Veils. Pretty oppressive card in any format that has fetch lands. And if your cube is reasonably powerful, it probably has fetch lands. However, if you don't have fetch lands, you don't have tutors, you don't have a lot of library searching, Narset Parter of Veils is just okay. It goes from being an incredibly oppressive card that is hard to deal with unless you kill it, to a card that basically does nothing. For another example, if you have a lot of lightning strikes and searing spears and stuff like that in your cube, things that deal 3 damage, lightning bolt effects, cards with greater than 3 toughness get a lot more powerful. If most of your removal is damage based and there are creatures that exceed that damage floor, they're going to be a lot stronger, and cards that have 3 or less toughness are going to be a lot weaker. I mean, this is a problem in Modern and Standard and stuff. Things are based on whether they die to lightning bolt, whether they die to, well, not Doomblade anymore, but things are evaluated based on the removal that is available, and if you have a lot of removal that can kill certain creatures, their power level goes down. Every single card in your cube is strengthened or weakened by the cards that surround it, and this is seen in designing Magic sets, as when you get a card reprinted, sometimes it's rare, sometimes it's uncommon. The rarity changes depending on how often the set designers want that card to appear. And this is how they control the speed of the format and how efficient removal is. Sometimes efficient removal will be at common, sometimes it's at uncommon. It really depends on how they want the format to go and how powerful they want certain creatures to be. And this is a bonus double lesson because the main takeaway here is actually that you shouldn't just include cards because you think you have to. Build your cube with intention. Every card should have a purpose, and it shouldn't be there necessarily just because it's strong. Obviously, you have your pet cards, you have your cards you want to include, and I think you're allowed to have some exceptions, but in general, most of your cards should be there for a reason, and you should be able to defend why that card is in your cube and make it make sense. And the second part of this lesson is that you need to be aware of different power levels, and this is including certain draftable themes. And you'll probably see this if you notice that the same deck is winning a lot more than other decks, you know you have a problem. So for example, if blue-red spell significantly performs better than other decks, the person playing it, regardless of who that is, usually wins the cube tournament or whatever, then you know that there's something happening. Maybe you've added too much support to that theme and not enough to others. And it's on you to investigate why, because there are numerous reasons that this could be happening, but you should be able to narrow down which one is the case in your cube. Is there an imbalance in the quality of game-winning cards? Is the mana curve all wonky? Is blue-red spells, for example, really low to the ground and fast, and is able to get an advantage with efficient removal, while other decks have to wait until, 4+ mana to get cards that have any real impact? Is there a missing piece that would make a weaker theme more appealing? For example, is there a counters deck, but you're missing hardened scales and other things that can up the power level of a counters deck? Are there more crossover cards that you can add that are appealing to both a spells deck and a counters deck, or other archetypes? Or on the other side of the coin, are there crossover cards that you added that are being scooped up primarily by the dominant deck, so that the other decks that might want to draft that card never gain access to it, and therefore are a bit diluted? Is there more efficient interaction that you can add so that other decks can deal with the dominant deck? As you can see, there are many potential sources of an imbalance, and I think you should be able to identify it in your own cube pretty easily. But definitely I would encourage you to watch any games that come up after you notice a deck winning. Monitor and watch a game where someone plays this deck and see if you can tell what its strengths and weaknesses are compared to its opponent. Creating a balanced environment like this is no easy task, and you'll probably go through a lot of iterations, and especially with 360 or 720 cards, it can be really hard to get that balance right, and even harder to track it because you're seeing different cards every time, you're maybe drafting with different people. It can be hard to get a consistent experience, which is fine, but it also makes it hard to know if you have a problem in your cube or if something just went wrong during the draft, or if it was sheer dumb luck. But anyways, those are 5 key lessons that I've learned about cube design, and they're all very intertwined. Maybe it kind of feels like one giant lesson about how changing something impacts other things, and you can support mechanics with more density. I think these things are pretty obvious, but they're philosophies. They're general philosophies that can help you build your cube. Let me know in the comments what you think of these tips and what some of your favorite cube design tips are. I'm not saying that these are always right or always the most important, but they're the ones I thought of for this video, and they're things that I like to think about when I design my own cubes. And I don't know. Let me know in the comments, and leave a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't. And let me know how you feel about these more face cammy videos. I don't do a lot of these, usually it's just voiceover, but I figured we wouldn't have a lot of visuals for this video, so I figured I'd give it a shot. So I will see you in the next one in a couple weeks. If you haven't noticed, I've been posting every 2 weeks on the dot, so stay subscribed if you want regular content, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.